The New York City Subway is one of the oldest subway systems in the world, with 472 stations, 248 miles of routes, 665 miles of revenue track, and service patterns that confuses not just tourists, but also local New Yorkers. In today's video, I'll be fully explaining the New York City Subway. Hope that by the end of this video, you would have learned something about this century-old subway system. To understand how the New York City subway functions today, we need to first talk about how the system came to be. Although New York's first true subway line didn't open until 1904, elevated and railroads that were built in Manhattan and Brooklyn prior to it were later integrated into the subway system. This included New York's first elevated, 9th Avenue Elevated, which opened in 1868, the IRT 2nd Avenue Elevated, 3rd Avenue Elevated, 6th Avenue Elevated, and the BMT Lexington Avenue line, etc. By the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century, these rail lines and elevated lines were purchased by the BRT, aka Brooklyn Rapid Transit, and IRT, aka Interborough Rapid Transit. The elevated in Manhattan were purchased by the IRT, while lines in Brooklyn and Queens were mostly purchased by the BRT. While elevated lines were massively built across New York City, people started to propose the idea of an underground subway. As early as 1869, Alfred Ellie Beach, an entrepreneur, founded a short demonstration subway tunnel under Broadway in Lower Manhattan. The subway cars were pushed by air pressure through the tube. Beach later proposed extending the line to Central Park. However, without political and financial support, nothing came to be. The tunnel was closed in 1873. New York's first subway to be in revenue service was approved in 1894 and opened on October 27, 1904. The line was operated by IRT. The 9.1-mile-long line ran from City Hall in Lower Manhattan, ran north along Lafayette Street and Park Avenue to 42nd Street. Then it turned west along 42nd Street to Times Square. Then it turned north to run along Broadway to 145th Street. In the upcoming decades, New York City subway expanded across its 4 boroughs. I said 4 boroughs because despite that there were plans for a subway to Staten Island, it never happened. Most of these lines were built by the government, then leased to the IRT and BRT for operation. BRT later became the BMT, aka Brooklyn Manhattan Transit, in 1923. The two companies integrated the previous rail and elevated lines with newly built subway into one system. By 1920, then Mayor of New York City John Hyland proposed a series of new city-operated subway lines to compete with the two private operators. This included the 6th and 8th Avenue trunk lines, the Queens Boulevard line in Queens, and the Grand Concourse line in the Bronx. If you take a close look at the alignments of these lines, you will notice that some of them parallel or overlap existing elevated lines. That is because they are intended to compete and eventually replace the elevated lines. The elevated lines in Manhattan were seen as old and noisy at the time, and people wanted them to be replaced by underground subways. The first city-owned subway line, the 8th Avenue line, opened in September 1932. These city-owned and operated lines were known as the Independent City-Owned Subway System, or IND for short. In 1940, IRT and BMT were bought by the government. The subway systems of the 3 companies were combined into one. IND and BMT lines had the same tunnel width and were called the B Division. Connections were built between the former tracks of the 2 companies. The IRT lines, on the other hand, had narrow tunnels and were called the A Division. Many transfers were built to connect the stations previously owned by different companies. After the integration, elevated lines in Manhattan were demolished and replaced by the newly built city-owned lines. In 1953, the New York City Transit Authority took control of the New York City subway, as well as the city's streetcar and bus system. By 1968, it was placed under control of the operator we know today, the state-owned Metropolitan Transportation Authority, or MTA for short. Now that we know how the rail lines, elevated lines, and subway lines of 3 different operators became one unified system, let us talk about how the New York City subway operates. This is perhaps the part that confuses the most first-time users and is also difficult to explain clearly. You see, in most transit systems around the world, a line and a route are the same thing. In New York, however, lines and routes usually mean two different things. Lines usually refer to a segment of railroad track that trains run on, such as IND 8th Avenue line we mentioned earlier. Route, on the other hand, refers to an operational pattern that could run on multiple lines to go from one end to the other. One line could also be serving multiple routes, such as A is a route that runs on the IND 8th Avenue line, IND Fulton Street line, and IND Rockaway line. Meanwhile, the IND 8th Avenue line serves the A, C, and E route, or train as what New Yorkers usually call them as. Routes are usually named after numbers and letters. A division routes are named after numbers, while B division routes are named after letters. The exception is the three shuttle routes: 42nd Street Shuttle, Rockaway Park Shuttle, and Franklin Avenue Shuttle. Although they use S as their designation, they are usually not referred to as the S train, but as shuttle instead. The designated color of each route is typically determined by the trunk line it runs on in Manhattan, such as 1, 2, 3 all run on the IRT Broadway 7th Avenue line in Manhattan and are designated as red. NQRW all run on the BMT Broadway line in Manhattan and are designated as yellow. Next, let us talk about the express and local services in the New York City subway. Express trains are trains that do not make all stops, while local trains are trains that make every stop. New York is able to operate these express services with the triple and quad-track lines it has. Triple-track lines usually operate peak direction express, with express trains to Manhattan in the morning and express trains to the outer boroughs in the evening. Quad-track lines, on the other hand, can operate express service in both directions at all times. Remember I said earlier that a line can serve multiple routes? These routes can also be assigned to run either express or local on that line, such as the A we mentioned earlier runs express on the IND 8th Avenue line and Fulton Street line, while the C, which also uses the IND 8th Avenue line and Fulton Street line, runs local. One thing to note that a route can be an express on one line but a local on another line, such as the E runs express on the IND Queens Boulevard line and runs local on the 8th Avenue line. Another thing to notice is that these service patterns could change during late nights and weekends, such as the C does not run during late nights and the A runs local instead. Besides regular service changes, there are also changes that occur due to things like track work, such as A train running by the D means that the A will not be using its regular route, but instead will be using the route that the D takes. Another example would be express trains running local, which means trains that usually run express will be running on the local track. The connections between lines and the triple and quad-track segments allow for operational flexibility. If something happens on one line, trains can be rerouted to another line. However, this also confuses many passengers, especially those who are first-time riders. Besides express service using triple and quad-track lines, the New York City Subway also operates the J and Z skip-stop service on the BMT Jamaica line. In short, during rush hours in the peak direction, the two services will alternate between serving the stations along the line, except for the major stations. The stations that the service does not serve will be bypassed. However, this service is not as efficient as the triple and quad-track express services, as it eats into capacity, impacts the headways, and it does not save much time. The service has been criticized by many people because of how rarely the Z shows up, and how inefficient it is. In this video, we learn about the history of the New York City subway and how the system operates in general. Since it is pretty complex already, I decided to explain each individual service, the rolling stocks, system modernization and expansion projects in a separate video. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the bell so you do not miss any future content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.